Sejam bem-vindos, então, à parte da tarde do nosso Congresso de História da Ciência e da Técnica. É, para mim, um prazer e um privilégio apresentar o professor Louis Pyenson. Eu digo o privilégio porque ele é dos mais eminentes historiadores da ciência na atualidade e tem um currículo tão longo de livros e artigos publicados nos Estados Unidos, na Europa, aqui por nós, na revista Cronos, e também na Ásia, que certamente levaria o tempo da conferência se eu fosse ler essa relação de livros e artigos. Mas desculpe, o professor Pyenson já está no Brasil pela segunda vez. Há mais de 20 anos ele esteve aqui conosco e fez uma magnífica conferência na Casa de Cultura Japonesa. E hoje ele, bastante amistosamente, veio por conta própria prestigiar o nosso congresso. E posso dizer para vocês que o livro dele, escrito juntamente com a esposa Susan, Servants of Nature, é um livro que nós ainda recomendamos e usamos, tanto na USP, quanto na Unesp e na Unicamp, só para citar esses que eu conheço. Mas ele vai nos falar sobre o livro mais recente dele, e ele fez a gentileza de colocar em espanhol. Ele não fala português, ele entende o português, mas eu acredito que, mesmo falando em inglês, com auxílio das transparências, vai ser possível seguir a apresentação. Ele pede que não hesitem em levantar a mão e fazer perguntas durante a apresentação, não precisa esperar até o fim. Ele gostaria, na verdade, que a conversa dele fosse um diálogo com as pessoas aqui presentes. Então, aproveitando tudo isto, vou convidar Lou, please. Uma salva de palmas para ele.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Gildo. I'm very happy to come back to the USPE. I was here 20 years ago. This place has grown, has matured. It is now one of the world's most famous universities, and you are honored. You should be proud to be associated with it. I am, and I'm very honored to speak to you today. I'd like to speak to you from the front. I don't like to speak sitting down. I'm not old enough for that, although that will come in time too. So please forgive me. You'll see my back a lot as I turn around to look at the screen. I should say that I want to dedicate this talk to my late friend John Heilbrunn, one of the greatest of historians of science of the last few generations, who suddenly died in Italy a week ago. Let me begin, since there's not much time. I'd like to talk to you today about Picasso and Einstein. All of you in the room will know that the two giants of the 20th century are often associated together. Ordinary people associate them together, and historians do. often uncritically. But you have to admit there's something the same about cubism and general relativity. We can talk for a long time metaphorically about what's the same, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm more interested in looking at reasons why the works of these two people may be considered on the same page. I'd like to propose to you that Picasso and Einstein are the last of the 19th century traditionalists. They did remarkable work, but they remained working in the 20th century in a 19th century mode. Brilliant, original, even revolutionary, but they were not really modern people. Perhaps you will agree with me at the end of 45 minutes that this is so. I'll do this by showing you first landscapes by Picasso. If you think of Picasso, probably the last thing that comes to mind are landscapes. Landscapes traditionally have lots of sky. They have trees and rocks. They may or may not have people, but basically it's about trees and buildings. The amazing thing is that Picasso painted landscapes across his entire career. Not only that, but the landscapes can be classified as traditional landscapes in the style of the 17th century, and I'll make an argument for that shortly. Einstein, of course, came up with relativity, quantum theory, but in some ways he was a conservative thinker. You will know that he never accepted indeterminacy in quantum mechanics. When everybody else in the physics community gave it a pass. They didn't understand it either, but they said, we'll accept this not understanding. And they came up with peculiar philosophies to justify it. Niels Bohr is a good example. If anyone here understands how Niels Bohr explains complementarity, please let me know after the talk. I read his stuff, and it's like a dog chasing his tail. It goes round and around and around. And perhaps that's what we have to settle with. That's a modern way of looking at physics. Einstein would not accept that. That's a 19th century search for certainty. Let me move ahead quickly. Let me show you some pictures these are pictures from a recent book about Picasso's landscapes. Just in this year, this book appeared, and I'll show you why I think this is not an accident. I'll tell you why I think this is not an accident at the very end of my talk. This is from the period when Picasso was moving up toward non-figurative painting. This is a picture of a reservoir, water reservoir in a town that he spent some time in 1909. I submit to you that this is a classical landscape, and my measure of this is the division of the landscape into three horizontal sections of sky and background and foreground. And you can see it's divided into thirds. That's exactly the definition of a classical landscape. The sky is at least 1/3 of the canvas. And I'll show you some other pictures to persuade you that this is consistent in his work. Those of you in art history may dispute this. We can talk about that in the question period, or we can talk now and I can give you my speech. But let me please show you a number of Picasso paintings to give you a sense of this. This is 13 years later, 11 years later, after World War I. Art historians tell us, and I think they're right, that after World War I, the avant-garde turned 180 degrees to embrace classicism. This is picked up in the Italian avant-garde, it's in the French avant-garde, it's certainly in Picasso's paintings of his various girlfriends as Greek goddesses, in fact, with statues in the background, classical busts. It's all figurative in the 1920s for Picasso. He retreated almost completely from non-figurative cubism. In fact, you could say that Picasso was a cubist, if you wanted to label him that, for only about 18 months. And he withdrew from cubism to embrace figurative painting before the First World War. We can talk about that if you like. But this is also a classical painting, classical landscape. Again, you see a third of the sky, a third of the canvas at least is devoted to the sky, and it's painted blue. It's not painted green or yellow. It's figurative. There's some 12 years later where Picasso is painting one of the towns in France where he could afford to live. You will ask yourself, perhaps, why Picasso moved around so much, living in different places. The short answer to that is he had the money. Remember that by 1914, Picasso was qualified as a member of the higher bourgeoisie in Paris. Friends would tell of ringing Picasso's doorbell around 1914 and being greeted by a maid in a uniform. This is not the Picasso of the Bohemian myth. This is really someone who has integrated himself almost completely with his patrons. That's very unusual, and it's not often recognized. A painting like this would appeal to someone of classical sensibility, a patron who wanted to buy it, and he could charge whatever he wanted for the painting. By the way, that rainbow is wrong. If you ever looked at a rainbow, the colors start with violet at the bottom and they end with red at the top. And Picasso started that way here, and then he double thought. He thought, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know enough physics. I haven't seen enough rainbows, so I'll put a blue-purple line at the very top. He would do that in his paintings. He would have second thoughts. A good example of that is the record of Guernica, which you probably know. His lover, and the only person who ever painted a painting with Picasso, took photographs of Guernica every day for 6 weeks as he was painting it. So we see the evolution of that painting. And he constantly comes up with second thoughts that are not in the preliminary maquette. It's the sign of a genius, I suppose. Moving ahead by about 10 years, 1940, I do not know whether this is before or after the German invasion of Paris. I'm guessing it's before in 1940, but I don't know. I don't have the month. But this is, he's in the south of France, and he's painting a landscape. It's clearly figurative, but this landscape is a modern landscape. It's modern because the sky is only a narrow band across the top, or at least in my understanding. So he's either upset or he wants to make a change, and we judge that by the size of the sky in the painting. And here we have a painting from about the same period. Those of you who know Paris know that this is the statue of Henri IV. He was called Le Vert Galant, the green gallant. What does that word galant mean? Someone? Gallant, but what is a gallant? Is it someone who's brave and honorable? No, someone who chases women. If someone is gallant, that's what, yeah, you don't rip the clothes off the lady, but you go from one to another. A womanizer, perhaps, is the best word in English. I don't know what the word in Portuguese is. There were none. There were none. Okay. This is quite a beautiful painting, but it's also a modern painting. The sky is hardly visible. You think that this is classical, but he's concerned in 1940 about the world falling apart, as well he might be. This is moving ahead 13 years. This he is titled, I'm not sure he gave it this title, but it's known as the transformer, an electrical transformer. It's not often noted that Picasso embraced modern science in his paintings. He didn't eliminate signs of industrialization from his landscapes. This happens as early, I found, as the late 19th century, when he was very young. He would paint telephone poles and telephone wires in the paintings that he did in Spain before he went to France. Here we see the same thing. This is looking out his window in Valerie. An electrical transformer, you would think today, is an ugly structure. He didn't see it that way. It was all part of nature to him. He painted this scene perhaps a dozen times, and all of them in the 1950s. Here is also a scene from 1953, whereas the previous one was a classical painting. This one is a modern painting. The sky is almost non-existent. Why do we think that this is right? Small sky means modern and big sky means traditional. Think of it this way. Small sky in a painting means that the viewer is forced to look at the immediate foreground, at things close at hand, at internal things. This fits very well with what I would call interiorization of painting in the first half of the 20th century. It fits very well with Freud, who takes the world by storm in the 1930s. It fits well with atomic physics, studying things that you can't see in laboratories with no windows. Scientists who work without seeing the light of day in a cave. Interiorization, all of it's interior. It's close at hand. That's what happens in modernism in the 20th century, or so I propose to you. And I'll give you a way of calculating that shortly. And this is a vision of dusk at Cannes, one of his preferred hideouts as he got older. He was hiding out from his old lovers and even his old wife. It occupied a tremendous amount of time to do that. He was constantly on the run, so to speak. And but this is it's almost a classical painting. Is that a third? I'm not sure. But look at the construction. Derek in the background. He could have painted it without that, but he included it. Modern science was okay for him. It's something that's not generally known. And if he were a bohemian, modern science would count for nothing. The Bohemians around 1900 think of that opera by Puccini, La Bohème. They care nothing about science. They don't know what medicine is. When the diva is dying of tuberculosis or something, pneumonia, they get some medicine for her. They don't know what it is. It's a quack medicine. It's worthless. There is no cure against either pneumonia or tuberculosis then. And Vivaldi, Puccini knew that. Picasso was not seduced by those things, I think. And this is, you know what an alborada is, yes? It's a serenade at dawn. Well, why are you serenading at dawn? Who in his right mind does that? Only people who have stayed up all night at a party. And what a party, right? And so that's what he's painting. But this is also a classical painting. Notice the low horizon. And figurative. In every way, this qualifies as a traditional landscape, it seems to me. So we see in Picasso, from beginning to end, there's a wave up and down of modern and traditional, modern and traditional, modern and traditional. Why is this interesting? I'll give you this last one, which is a modern landscape because of the very small sky. Everything is in the foreground. Everything is toward the interior. It forces you almost to look at your feet instead of at the sky. One way of measuring all this stuff is to formulate what I tried to do in what I call the horizon index. Simply take a painting and decide if it has a high or a low horizon. A high horizon means equal to or less than, or equal to or higher than the top third of the canvas. Remember, we saw the thirds in the canvas. Some of them are just narrow strips. Those are higher than 1/3. Those would be high horizon paintings. If you have a collection of paintings for a given period of time, take the number of paintings that have a high horizon and divide that by the number of paintings that have a low horizon, and it gives you a number. So a number of 1 for the horizon index would mean that all the paintings in a collection have half of them with high horizons and half with low horizons, whatever the actual number is. The ratio is interesting because it doesn't depend on the actual number. Is this a robust number? And here's a calculation that I did using the Picasso paintings, and also a second book on landscape paintings which appeared this year. It's by someone who is not known as a landscape painter also. His name is Edvard Munch. You know him as the artist who did The Scream, that figure of the face on a bridge with an open mouth in horror. It's seen as the emblematic picture of modern angst and horror at everything in the modern world. Munch was a figurative painter. In all the paintings that I've seen of him, including this book, there is not a single non-figurative abstraction. There's nothing in the line of Cubism. There's nothing in the line of Miro, who is a non-figurative painter, or some of Kandinsky, none of that in Munch. And yet, if we do the horizon index by the Munch landscapes, and there are plenty of them in the book that I cite here, it turns out that he is more consistently a modernist than Picasso. And so you begin to look at his landscapes, and you see that his landscapes have very small, very high horizons. And this fits with his identification as the archetypical representative of the modern world in its psychological presentation. So it tells us something that we might have guessed, but from another point of view. And it leads me to have more confidence in the horizon index for other calculations, which I can show you, but I better not explain. Here is the horizon index for major online collections in museums around the world. I did this 5 years ago. The numbers might be a bit different today, but I don't think it would be much. What you see in the major collections in Europe and certainly in Europe, in the Netherlands, the Low Countries, which is the place, for better or worse, that invented landscape painting in the 17th century into the 18th century. The whole notion that you could present something that you could persuade people to buy a painting that was about nothing in particular except trees and fields and sky. This was a tremendous innovation and an important one for artists. Why? Because you can paint skies very quickly. I mean, if you're a talented artist, you can paint a sky in, say, 2 hours. Whereas to paint a face and have it be recognizable of a person, that takes more time. So you can turn out more paintings if you could persuade people to buy landscape paintings than portrait paintings or paintings of people. Anyway, if you look at the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands, you see that skies are the horizon is very low in the 19th century in their collection, and then the horizon rises, eventually rising almost exponentially in the 20th century. This is confirmed in the Met Museum in New York, in the Detroit Art Institute, 2 other online collections I looked at. But the North Americans, in the North American collections, the horizons rise about 30 years later. So there's a 30-year lag between the North American collection and the Netherlands. Then I make a technical argument saying that in one country, at least, horizons fall in the 1980s and 1990s, and that's Argentina. Something happens to painting in Argentina where landscape paintings return to a traditional mode, I contend, although the data is a little bit is not sufficient yet. And it has to do, well, the easy explanation is the end of the dictatorship there, 1983. So there's a feeling of freedom, of suddenly people can breathe, maybe a little bit of optimism, and there's a euphoric landscape movement. And anybody who knows Jojo Noe and his paintings, the greatest living artist in Argentina, can see that in his paintings. We can go there in the question period, if you like, and you can shoot me down with counterexamples. Let's move ahead quickly since time is not our friend. And this is the collection that I was talking about, that I used to propose that there's a change in Argentine attitudes towards landscape painting, but also a change in Argentine science. And I looked at a painting collection in the largest Argentine nuclear accelerator lab. Why is there a collection of 300 paintings from 1980s and 1990s in a nuclear accelerator lab? Well, it's because of one chemist who was there who was an art fan, and he persuaded 306 artists to donate one work each of their paintings to hang on the wall of the laboratory. Most of these painters, nearly all of them, were alive. The paintings come overwhelmingly from the 1980s and 1990s. The laboratory is called Tandar. It's open to the public, but it takes some doing to get to see it. It is the largest collection, the most varied collection of postmodern Argentine art in Argentina. Next time you go to Argentina, go to the Atomic Energy Commission, knock on their door and ask to see it. They'll let you in. You just give them your passport and they'll show you the paintings. Anyway, the horizon index of those paintings resembles the horizon index of the early 20th century at North American museums. So it's a low landscape index. It's a return to classicism. At just this time, the nuclear accelerator lab decided to take apart their accelerator and stop using it. Not smash atoms anymore, but instead look up to the sky and measure cosmic rays. They built a cosmic ray observatory in the foothills of the Andes, and they got involved in building stuff for space satellites commercially. None of this stuff working in a laboratory with no windows, everything looking to the wider universe. That's exactly what you see with the paintings by Noe and another painter that I looked at. We can talk about that if you have questions, but let's move on. Let's move to Einstein, since I mentioned him at the beginning of the talk. Some of you may know that one of the perennial questions for philosophers is, was Einstein a positivist? Did Einstein embrace Ernst Mach, the Austrian physicist, in his positivistic philosophy? Is positivism at the root of relativity? Relativity means you can't tell. Everything's the same, right? Positivism says just look at the facts. Don't come up with theories. Don't say anything about absolute space. And Mach indeed questioned absolute space. I can't begin to tell you the hundreds of square kilometers of trees that have died to support this thesis. It turns out it's wrong. Einstein was not interested in Mach because of his so-called positivist philosophy. Mach was, in Central Europe, one of the most fervent voices for educational reform. He thought that engineering and science students didn't need to learn Greek and Latin. They needed to learn more math and do more experiments. That was a modernist impulse. He promoted that when no one else did in the 19th century. Einstein had no Greek and very, very little Latin. He was, as a classicist, he was nowhere. I mean, his philosophy, if you read it, the philosophers he talks about are modern philosophers the last 500 years, not the Greeks. He would have felt entirely comfortable with Mach in arguing for a modern focus on experiments in universities and a little bit more mathematics. Einstein has a difficult relationship with mathematics, but after 10 years of resisting, he finally jumps in and learns differential calculus. differential absolute calculus of Levi-Civita and Ricci-Clibastro. And that's what general relativity is formulated in 1911, 1912. Einstein thought that Mach, the other attraction for Einstein and Mach was that Mach was a vociferous anti-militarist. This drawing of a bullet's faster than a bullet traveling faster than sound, it's a supersonic bullet, was the experiment that gave us that term that everybody knows about Mach. Mach 1, Mach 2, what these fast warplanes fly, faster than the speed of sound. Mach 1 is the speed of sound, Mach 2 is 2 times the speed of sound, and on it goes. This appealed to Einstein. Einstein read this page of notes in preparation for his exams in 1900 at the Zurich Polytechnic, and he probably attended the lecture where this picture was drawn on the blackboard 2 years before. This would mark, I think, the first reference we have, the first piece of evidence that Einstein knew something about Ernst Mach. Nothing to do about philosophy here, but it's a very clever experiment. We can describe it in the question period if you're interested. Mach was embraced by students everywhere in Europe at the time as someone who fought against authority, was in favor of students, was against the military, all those things that we like. Students didn't really give a drat about positivism. What is positivism in 1900? Someone? It's a religion. There's a positivist church. There's more than one. There's one in London. There's one in Paris. You can go worship at the positivist church every Sunday. Comte, at the end of his life, dreamed for a reunification of the Catholic Church. Let me see, how does this go? The Catholic Church, and there were 3 parts to the kingdom he wanted to create. This has nothing to do with scientific rationalism. And in fact, Mach's version of positivism is more a sentiment than it can be called a philosophy. I understand people write in Latin America about the positivistas, especially in Mexico, in Brazil too. Saint-Simon in the 19th century was instrumental, was important here in education to some extent. You've got to be very careful when you search for a guru who is supposed to animate a genius. A genius doesn't need a guru. What a genius needs is legitimation for what's coming up with. So you do something, it turns out to be very popular, and you start looking for someone to legitimize this in the eyes of the wider public. So, I mean, you look for a philosopher. Why not? There are plenty of them. Sometimes this looking turns out to be ridiculous. Something I was looking at last week in Buenos Aires. One of the great reforming presidents of Argentina, his name was Irigoyen, somehow, and who knows how he found his way to this philosopher, his name was Krause. He was an obscure materialist philosopher of the early 19th century let me get this straight, in Austria. For some reason, some of his books were translated into Spanish in the 1850s and 60s, and this Spanish philosophical community in Europe gave serious consideration to them. There's nothing original there. It's hylozoic, all is one. Everything's wrapped together in a big, vague view of the universe, living things, non-living things, but without any precision. Schelling, if you know him, is kind of like this in the early 19th century. So this president of Argentina embraced him, and suddenly everybody was reading Krause in the 1920s. And he had a following among academic philosophers. I tried reading him, and my Spanish is not perfect, but in Spanish, and it doesn't make much sense at all. And there's no reason for it. Now, Einstein may have been looking around for legitimation for his notion of relativity, since Mach does use the word. Lots of people use the word. Poincaré uses the word. Einstein decided not to go with a French writer. He could have, but it tells us nothing about the genesis of his theory. Really great minds do not follow slavishly a philosophical dogma, or indeed a religious dogma for that matter. But you may have your own opinions about that. I didn't mean to talk so long about that. Since we dealt with drawing and painting, it's not well known that Einstein was trained in drawing. Every mathematics course, every science course in the 1890s in Europe trained future scientists and engineers in drawing. Why? Because there was no other way, easy way to represent what you saw. Photography was just beginning to be able to print photographs in mass media. Before about 1890, photographs that were printed in books faded. They didn't last more than about 10 years, and people still preferred engravings or lithographs, which also depended on the individual hand. If you need any demonstration of this, just look at Darwin's drawings on his travel around the world, where he stopped in Brazil, he stopped in Argentina. Everywhere he went, he sketched things, and he used watercolor. He used color to render the view appealing to people who would see it. Which scientist today can say that she or he has studied drawing for several years in secondary school? I mean, do secondary schools teach drawing to anybody except future in art academies? I don't know. I doubt it. This becomes very important in what I'm about to show you. This kind of drawing, being able to project shadows onto curved surfaces, can be done from first principles by something called projective geometry. It's related to descriptive geometry, and by the end of the century, the two terms are used pretty much interchangeably. But projective geometry is non-Euclidean geometry. If there's anything that you as an audience can easily pick up from Einstein's view of space and time, is that it's a non-Euclidean geometry. Space is non-Euclidean. It's not flat. It's curved. This is Einstein's first engagement with curved space-time. I mean, it's not time, but certainly curved space. Einstein was trained as a classical figure artist. This is the entrance hall to his secondary school. This is a colegio, a secondary school in Switzerland. It's a palace, and those are statues from antiquity that were made in plaster. The students were required to draw those and sketch them on a flat piece of paper, and Einstein was among them. This is just the exterior of that school, figurative, symbolic paintings of three of the faculties where students were expected to go: law, justice, and theology. There was a fourth mural on the other side devoted to science, which does no longer exist. This is about, that picture was taken about 6 or 7 years ago. When Einstein went to the Polytechnical School in Zurich, he was training along, most of his other students were going to become engineers. And they all learned drawing, and they all had before them images of figurative drawing. These are two allegories, one of technology, one of science. You can see them today. I took this photograph about 6 or 7 years ago. They were in place when Einstein was a student there. He would have walked by them and seen them every day. And it surely attuned him to classical things. But I call your attention to these things, which interest me greatly. These are models in plaster of mathematical surfaces that can be described by equations. The man whom you know who dealt with three-dimensional models is Felix Klein. Felix Klein was a mathematician in Germany. He's the guy who named the thing called the Klein bottle. It's a three-dimensional projection of a four-dimensional object of a closed surface that is not closed in 3 dimensions. Or there are problems with it. You have to assume that the wraparound in the bottle is an infinitesimal hole in the skin of the bottle to make it do this. But he came up with a commercial operation to represent a zoo, literally a zoo, of mathematical surfaces that didn't represent anything except equations in the 1880s and 1890s. These are not people. These are not heads of philosophers or kings or nude women. No, these are non-figurative models, projections in 3 dimensions of higher level surfaces, basically. Klein sold them to every university in Germany, many universities abroad. I looked around for a couple of weeks in Buenos Aires recently for these. I didn't find any. They tell me that if they ever existed, they've been destroyed or missing. Somewhere in Brazil, there are these models. It's inconceivable to me that there would not be a collection here. But that's for you to find out if you're interested. There are no more. Maybe they never had it. Maybe they never had them. And if they never had them, that becomes very important because the people who were reading about relativity in 1914, the people who were buying Picasso's Cubist paintings in 1914 would have been familiar with these objects. These would have been entrepreneurs in industry, mechanical engineers, civil engineers, architects, artists, secondary school math teachers. Every secondary school math teacher would have seen pictures of these things at the university that he went to. In those days, mathematicians were almost all he. So if there were none in Brazil, if there were none in Argentina, that helps us understand why the enthusiasm for relativity, the enthusiasm for cubism arrived in both places only in the 1930s, late 1930s, early 1940s. It's a generation after Europe was infected with it. It's not because people didn't know about it, it's because they had no context for appreciating it. This is just one element of an argument. Another element which I used in Argentina is wallpaper. You may think that's for old ladies to think about designing their home. In the 19th century, late 19th century, every house in Europe had wallpaper. Rich, poor, and they probably played that too. Wallpaper was everywhere. There's no wallpaper in here. The walls here are naked. In South America, part of the explanation for that is that paper production here was very difficult to do. There was no, I believe that Argentina did not manufacture wallpaper from local wood until the 1940s. They imported all the wood pulp from Norway and Canada. And it may be that Brazil did the same thing. So the wallpaper that was manufactured would have been difficult to make here and an extremely limited variety. When I studied wallpaper for several weeks in Paris, there are wallpaper archives. There are museums of wallpaper in Europe. It turns out that at the Louvre, there's one of them, the Museum of Decorative Art. And in that museum, you can see that there's a transition in kinds of patterns that are used for wallpaper right around 1902, roughly 10 years before Cubism. It's enough time for there to be this new style of geometrical designs in the kitchens of rich people, the wife of a lawyer, of a jurist, of an engineer, head of a factory. Just the people who had so much money they didn't know what to spend it on. So the man would go out, go to an art show and say, I'll buy this. Maybe in 5 years it'll be worth something. He could bring it home and his wife would not be horrified because she's got the stuff on her wall. That's a hypothesis. And so I'm still looking for wallpaper in Argentina. Last week, I went to the Museum of Design in Buenos Aires. It's an old mansion, one of the richest people in Buenos Aires around 1910. I'm looking at wallpaper. I want to see what they put on their walls, and it's all wood and cloth, silk. So the stuff that your clothes were made out of, you would see on the wall, or you would see wood on the wall, paneling like this, although not in the same style, but wood. There was no wallpaper. Wallpaper was very rarely used in South America, is my guess. If you know a secondary source on this, please let me know, because I've looked, and wallpaper doesn't attract the attention of historians of art here, or at least not that I can find. Anyway, these non-figurative designs widely circulating in Europe a generation before Cubism, a generation before relativity. That's the point I want to make. So it becomes easier for people to embrace something that otherwise would be seen as like it landed from Mars. That's the argument. Not such a good reproduction. Einstein took as many as 10 courses in geometry as a student. This is from his professor of projective geometry. It shows what students were expected to be able to do. They were expected to be able to represent complex geometrical forms projected as shadows against the background. Why? Well, this is a little bit hard to make out, and it's not done completely accurately, but there's a prism that's been jammed through a sphere, and it's sitting on top of something else, and the claroscuro, the shading, is supposed to give you a sense of volume. So you see it as three-dimensional. Why is this important? It's because until photographs were able to be used commercially in catalogs, for machines or for clothes or washing machines or anything, bottles, cups, all of those designs had to be drawn by hand. So there was employment for people who could draw quickly in 3 dimensions and give a sense of volume. And all you have to do is look at 19th century illustration to realize that that's true. In the 20th century, that disappears. By 1960, it's gone. And it happens, I think, a lot earlier even. Suddenly, ladies' magazines have photographs instead of line drawings. There had to be people to make those line drawings. And they had to be able to draw very quickly, and it had to be believably 3-dimensional. So you needed depth. And that's what part of this was. But you can't sell that in that way. Why can't you do that? Because you can't really say to a student, well, this is not just good enough. You fail the course. So the student says, why, professor? And the professor says, this is not good enough. It doesn't look real enough. The student says, why? He says the shading is wrong. The student says, why? Teach me how to make shading better. And the professor says, no, you just have to do it more and more and more and more. You can't do that in a university. Maybe that's how art is done now. I don't know. But you still can't do that. You have to offer a reason why something is not good enough. And in mathematics and projective geometry, there's a reason. You can describe where the shadows go by first principles using projective and descriptive geometry. So you can test students in their knowledge of something by making the argument, somehow this is related to your ability to be an artist. Is it true? Probably not. But at least you can make the argument, and you can test students on whether they master this very rigorous mathematics. Some of you may be old enough, maybe not. When I was a student, when I was 13, 14 years old, everybody studied Euclidean geometry. Triangles. Did you ever do that in school? You young people, you're not sure you did. They made us do it for a year, doing Euclid's proofs. And why did they make us do it? Everybody had to do it in school, in public school. This is not private school. Why? And they invented some ridiculous explanation that said it teaches you logical reasoning. If you believe that, you probably shouldn't be in this university. There's nothing logical. I mean, there's a step-by-step sequence of proving something, but it's not the only way of being logical. And anyway, who said logic is the most important thing to learn as a student? I don't think so. I think love is. And people have tried to produce a geometry of love. The poets do that all the time. You'll know if they're close to the mark. But in any event, you could be tested in the principles of perspectival drawing by making students learn this very involved mathematics of projection. Einstein called these things fiddle work, and he had a lot of trouble with it. He used that term in a letter to his future wife, Mileva marriage. Those of you who know that story know that there's some controversy about whether she helped invent relativity. She was a mathematician. And he said, well, I had a tough time with this exam by this guy, and it's all fiddle work. It's very exacting drawing, a lot of drawing straight lines to make projections according to angles. And you get, I think I have another one. You get this here too. On the left, you see this fiddle work. This is the most important thing that geometry did in the 19th century, and it dealt with conic sections. If you take a cone, like those things on the road that are red, that they put up and say, don't go here, a cone like a fool's cap, you take those and you slice them in various ways, you can get a circle, an ellipse, and a hyperbola. Those are three curved surfaces with 3 dimensions. They can be made into surfaces. In 2 dimensions, they're lines. They are the elements of beginning instruction in projective and descriptive geometry. I call your attention to the sketch in the upper right-hand corner of that left paper, Conic Sections by Fiedler. The date is 1878. He taught those for the next 20 years. And I call your attention to the first diagram of space-time by a man named Hermann Minkowski. In color, it was a diapositive, so he used it in a lecture a lecture that preceded this technology from a projector at the back of the room. And you see that the first space-time diagram is nothing but a conic section. That's exactly what Minkowski was teaching, and he taught it to Einstein. Einstein may have forgotten it, but it was there, and the other professors taught to Einstein as well. Einstein later, he was skeptical about Minkowski's space-time, but he later made it into what we understand as general relativity. And it was only 4 years after this that the term general relativity and gravitation, using Levi-Civit's calculus of three-dimensional space, is used by Einstein. The stuff of projective geometry and complex surfaces is directly relevant, at least to Einstein. Before I read this quotation, and you can scan it, this is a famous quotation by Cezanne, the artist. Is everybody comfortable reading Spanish, or at least you can figure it out more or less? Well, let's move ahead with this. I'm running out of time. Oh my. Yeah. Okay. Hurry up. This is perhaps the most famous of all descriptions by modern artists about instructions about how to do modern art. Cezanne is the man most admired by Picasso and by many other modern artists. What is Cezanne saying here? Cezanne is in some sense the father of Cubism. If you look at the paintings of Cezanne, he paints landscapes with straight lines everywhere. Triangles, squares. What you don't see in Cezanne's paintings are circles, cones, and spheres. But that's what he says here. This is advice to an artist. 1904. He repeated this in 1905, shortly before he died. Why is he talking about things that are curved when modern art is all about straight lines? I mean, think of Picasso's Cubism only as one example. Yeah, I know, you say, well, eventually they get to curves. Miro does curves. Kandinsky is all over the place. But the early modernists were all about straight lines, and there's a reason for that. I think it has to do with electric lights and the shadows they cast, but that's for another time. It's because circles, what he calls spheres, cylinders, and cones are what makes the geometry, the projective and descriptive geometry that I showed you before. And in fact, just a few frames before, I showed you conic sections from the late 19th century directly into Minkowski space-time. It's because they're called conic sections from Greek antiquity. Apollonius was the guy who gave us these classical forms, the mathematics behind these classical forms. It's because, as Cezanne says, that's what they taught me in school. And he went to a number of art schools. They taught him projective and descriptive geometry, just as they taught prescriptive and descriptive and projective geometry to all the engineers in the late 19th century in Europe. And that's what he's talking about here. He's not denying that, you can use this stuff to draw paintings with straight lines, because there are no straight lines here. So the art historians don't understand that. Not a single one of them that I've read has come up with this parallel tradition of using circles and spheres and cones in mathematics instruction for artists, among other things. Perhaps you know of some secondary sources that do that. So let me I think this is the last slide. I'd just like to conclude with a modest proposal that in many ways Einstein and Picasso were the last of a 19th century tradition rather than the first of an avant-garde 20th century tradition. They're kind of like, think of this, Moses leading the tribes around in the wilderness for 30 years, climbing to the top of the mountain and seeing the promised land, but Moses never setting foot in it. That kind of thing. So they're giants. I don't mean to denigrate, to say anything bad about their innovations, but I think their historical position needs some clarification. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.